Hello, greetings from Basel in Switzerland to you wherever you are who see and hear these sermons. We're in a series on the book of Acts, and we've come to the beginning of chapter 23. You might remember that Paul has come to Jerusalem for the Feast of Pentecost, and he has, under the advice of the apostles, sponsored some men who are making vows of a Nazirite, and he needs to take them into the temple so that they can go through the ceremonies and pay their fees. And when he was in the temple, some Jewish people started a riot claiming that he had brought a Gentile into the temple beyond the Gentile court of the temple, which is completely illegal and punishable by death. And a riot started because Paul was known and the Christians were known, and there was a certain amount of tension in the city already. And the riot became so bad that the commander of the Roman forces in the neighboring fortress of Antonia came down and stopped the riot and arrested Paul, who was the center of it, and brought him into the fortress, into the barracks. And then he wanted to get to the bottom of it, so he made the Sanhedrin gather together, the Supreme Court of Israel, and brought Paul to them for a trial. And the trial was not in the temple, it was in a neighboring building, so the Romans could be there, the Gentiles could be there. And the commander could see and hear what went on and find out, he hoped, what the situation was. So beginning in verse 1, Paul looked straight at the Sanhedrin. So he's brought in, there are 71 men. It's the Supreme Court. He looked right at them and he said, "My brothers, I have fulfilled my duty, or I have lived to God in all good conscience to this day." Now that needs to be unpacked a little. He is being accused of teaching that Jews do not need to obey the law of Moses anymore, which was a misunderstanding because he had taught the Gentiles who became Christians that they did not need to be circumcised. So that was exaggerated, and the rumor was widely believed that he taught against the law of Moses, and that he taught and acted against the temple by desecrating the temple, by bringing a Gentile into the temple. So those were the two charges that had been shouted and was the basis of the gathering of the Sanhedrin. So Paul begins by defending himself against those charges. And he says he has fulfilled his duty, he has lived to God in all good conscience to this day. And he means in terms of the law of Moses. He doesn't mean completely, because he doesn't have a good conscience about the stoning of Stephen and some other things, arresting Christians and having them imprisoned and killed. He doesn't have a good conscience about that, but he does have a good conscience about the charges that are actually made against him. Now, that may have been slightly out of order, because normally in a court situation, the accusation is made, the charges are presented, and then the defense. But Paul, who was a lawyer and knew very well how things worked, began with his defense as the first speaker. Verse 2, "At this, the high priest Ananias ordered those standing near Paul to strike him on the mouth." We don't know if they hit him or not, but Paul said to him, "God will strike you, you whitewashed wall." And whitewashed wall was sort of a symbol of making things that were flimsy and fragile look solid. So it was a hypocritical wearing a mask situation. "You sit there to judge me according to the law, yet you yourself violate the law by commanding that I be struck." Now that's actually a question. Do you sit there and also you violate the law by commanding that I be struck? In the Jewish culture for many years, we find it through the Old Testament and now in the New Testament, questions were often answered by questions and accusations were made by questions. Why do you do this? When it's clear that they have actually done this. And it was a cultural thing that they answered the question with the question. So Paul is making an accusation, but in terms of a question. And this, people still do this today. There's the story of the man who asked another man, why do you always answer questions with a question? And the other man said, do I do that? So he makes this strong accusation against Ananias. And those who were standing near Paul said, how dare you insult God's high priest? Actually, they said, do you dare insult God's high priest? Paul replied, brothers, I did not realize that he was the high priest, for it is written, do not speak evil about the ruler of your people. That's from Exodus chapter 22, verse 28. Now, this is Paul as a lawyer at his most subtle and his most dangerous, because he says, brothers, I did not realize that he was the high priest. Now, he certainly recognized Ananias because he would have known who he was, and Ananias would have been sitting in the high priest's chair. But Paul says he didn't realize he was the high priest because he was breaking the law. So he continues his accusation in his apology. For it is written, do not speak evil about the ruler of your people. And Paul, knowing that some of them were Sadducees and others Pharisees, called out to the Sanhedrin, my brothers, I am a Pharisee, descended from Pharisees. I stand on trial because of the hope of the resurrection of the dead. Now, this is also very subtle, because it's going to go on to explain that the Pharisees believed in the resurrection of the dead, and the Sadducees did not believe in the resurrection of the dead. And Paul is not directly referring to this opposition and dispute among the Pharisees and the Sadducees. He's talking about the resurrection of Jesus, because Jesus is the center of Paul's life and the center of all his writing and discussion and defense and debate. And so when he says, I stand on trial because of the hope of the resurrection of the dead, he doesn't mean because he's a Pharisee, but because he's a Christian, that he's on trial for believing in the resurrection of the dead. Jesus is the center of everything, of history and salvation and meaning and creation. And we need to remember that. I remember when I was working as a missionary in Poland during communism in the late 80s, there was a man in a discussion in the street who was apparently a police spy, who asked me, what do you think of the government, which was a puppet government of Moscow in Warsaw at the time? And a pastor who was with me stepped between me and this man and said, that is not the question. The question is, what do you think of Jesus Christ? I thought, well, that was dramatic and a big change of subject. And then I realized, well, but that's the point, isn't it? The basic point is, what does anybody think of Jesus Christ? And so we need to be relating all questions and situations to Jesus, as Paul is doing here when he's on trial in the Sanhedrin. When he said this, a dispute broke out between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. The Sadducees say that there is no resurrection and that there are neither angels nor spirits. So the idea that the Pharisees held was that there was a resurrection, there was a continuing life after death, which was possible, and that this resurrection might not be in the form of a physical human being, but might be in an angel, a messenger, or a spirit of that person. So it could be natural or supernatural, but it was a continuing life. So the Sadducees say there is no resurrection at all, and there are no angels or spirits that are the manifestation of the continuing life of a person. But the Pharisees believed both these things. So here we have an extreme form of identity politics. This is the Supreme Court and the Parliament of Israel, and they are identified as Pharisees and Sadducees, and those identities are so strong that the whole political system and debate is based on this. And the question was not justice or court order or what was Paul actually accused of. The whole thing was the identity politics of Pharisees and Sadducees. And Paul knew this. And so he said, I am on trial because of my belief in the resurrection of the dead, meaning Jesus. But they think in terms of their conflict with each other. And so they start a fight. There was a great uproar, and some of the teachers of the law who were Pharisees stood up and argued vigorously. We find nothing wrong with this man, they said. What if a spirit or an angel has spoken to him? And they're referring to his account, which he gave that day the day before, outside in public, about his meeting Jesus on the road to Damascus. And they're remembering this testimony that Paul gave and saying, what if a spirit, the spirit of Jesus, because we believe in the resurrection, and so Paul says Jesus has been resurrected, we believe that's possible, or an angel, the angel of Jesus, has spoken to him. Meaning, if an angel or a spirit of Jesus resurrected has spoken to Paul, then we're working against God if we work against Paul's testimony. So the Pharisees were much more open to the possibility of Jesus resurrecting and of Jesus being Lord than the Sadducees were because of their belief in the resurrection. The dispute became so violent that the commander was afraid Paul would be torn to pieces by them. He ordered the troops to go down and take him away from them by force and bring him into the barracks. The following night, the Lord, coming to him or standing near Paul, said, "Take courage. As you have testified about me in Jerusalem, so you must also testify in Rome." And the point is to testify or to be a witness, and the Greek word for witness is martyr, to be a witness to Jesus. The point is not to defend himself. And that's very important, that the point is to testify to Jesus. And what we take away from this is the centrality of Jesus and the fact that in all the circumstances and questions of life and meaning and history and law, Jesus is the answer. God bless you. Amen.